Okay. Tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Asha Andersen, and we're here for another meaningful conversation with my good friend Barbara Belger and my other good friend Ursula Edgington. Dr. Ursula Edgington, welcome to you both.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hi, welcome. Nice to meet you, Ursula. Good to see you again, Asha. And kia ora, everybody. Looking forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, this is a big one, and I think one that we're all quite interested in, and mass formation and the steps towards totalitarianism and the phenomena that we see unfolding within our societies, locally and globally at the moment. And of course, there is one man in particular who has been speaking a lot on this particular phenomenon of mass formation, Mattias Desmet, and you're both about to finish his book, I think so, and have been following many of the podcasts and other videos that he has been putting out around the idea of mass formation and what is the process that that people are going through that's actually causing such division and a fracture in how we think and how we, I suppose, how we perceive as a society, you know, whether we are in unity or whether there's division or whether there is a narrative that's being spun. So lots of interesting things to talk about regarding mass formation. Barbara, would you just introduce us perhaps to the idea and maybe a little bit about what you see happening?
Sure. And I'm excited to hear Ursula's take on it all. I'm sure we don't have time to go into all of it, but I envy you for being much further into the book than I am. I came across Mattias Desmet early on in the Corona Committee, the German lawyers actually, with Viviane Fischer and Dr. Rainer Füllmich, who interviewed him pretty early on in the 2020s, I think even. And he's been back since, and he was on their grand jury. He was one of the witnesses in the grand jury proceedings. and what fascinated me right away. Pardon?
No, do we just had a little bit of a technical with Ursula?
There you are.
I'm here. Sorry, I don't know what happened there.
No worries.
Yeah.
Was it at my end?
I think so.
We must have touched on some important words.
We've said that keyword totalitarianism and
I mentioned Dr. Füllmich, so
yeah.
I think that name rings lots of NSA bells.
This is the problem. Paranoid, don't you? Absolutely paranoid about the the anti-government rhetoric and
I don't think it's paranoia. I think it is just it's just awareness.
Realistic.
Yeah, these things can happen or not. I mean, I've been fascinated with surveillance, I suppose, ever since I'm aware that data collection exists. If I were in the market for collecting data from people, especially biometric data, then everything we do on all these social media accounts is valuable data. So and the best bidder wins, you know. So but yes, so we have nothing to hide. We don't ever seal our envelopes when we write letters. We just leave them open for everyone to read. So it doesn't really matter. But so I don't want to take too long because I'm very keen to hear what Ursula says. So the 4 main points, just very briefly. 4 factors that need to be present in a society. People need to be isolated, so they need to experience a lack of social bond. And I was supposed to be in a network meeting for service providers today, and that was cancelled because somebody was sick, and information was sent And one of them is a real good resource for Heart and Minds or something it's called. And one of the ministries here in New Zealand even, and I wasn't aware, is I'm not sure, it's not the ministry, but it is a group or an association or something for loneliness. So, I mean, yes, it existed. You know, the Ministry of Loneliness was in place for quite some time in the UK. And Mattias mentions that, of course, also about Belgium. But anyway, so we're never far behind with all this. Yeah. The second factor is people, they need to experience a sense of making meaning in life. Humans love to make meaning of everything. And as opposed to animals, which Mattias talks about, we mainly have our thoughts, which are words, and our language, which are words, and very limited other abilities to actually express. But anyway, so lacking of sense making in life. And then the third one, and that really fascinated me, is this free floating anxiety. And we'll maybe get into that later. I'm just mentioning it here. And this free floating psychological discontent, it needs to be in the mind of people without people really being able to connect it to anything, Mattias says. And at the moment where this mass formation happens, all the anxiety and so a solution gets presented by, of course, very clever people, and then people form this mass and then project all their anxiety. They don't have to address their anxiety, just project it outwards and connect through that. That was my understanding. So yeah, just that. He also mentions a book that I'm very keen to get called Bullshit Jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and we're all doing, since industrialization, we're not actually doing meaningful jobs with very few exception. I think our work, I'm not sure what you're doing, our work, Asha, is maybe more meaningful because we are in the place of helping other people, but a lot of jobs that have been created are directly connected to this meaninglessness. So anyway, please take it from here.
Okay, so yeah, that's really interesting, Barbara. Thank you for that sort of summary of Desmet's factors, the 4 important factors. So I think from my perspective, obviously I'm from England. I've only been in New Zealand for about 8 years. So I'm still kind of learning the ropes in terms of the New Zealand culture. And one of the things that I've been writing about as an educationalist with some of my colleagues as well from all over the world is the cultural competence element of education and how that differs in New Zealand compared to other cultures that I'm used to, which is, you know, European and in America. So there are some factors that New Zealand is particularly vulnerable in terms of these 4 factors in particular. So and one of those comes back to what I wrote about in my PhD was, you know, trying to measure the unmeasurable. You talk about surveillance, Barbara, and the importance of data and all of the rest of it. I mean, there's very much just a whole kind of literature on trying to measure things in teaching and learning in the UK and how to maximize what they call best practice, which doesn't really exist in New Zealand. There is no real quality assurance. I know this is controversial because teachers might argue against this, but from my perspective as a tertiary teacher whose specialism is quality assurance, there is no real quality management in New Zealand. And if there is, the assessments are flawed. And so there's a kind of a different angle on how that surveillance works in New Zealand. It's maybe more a psychological game, you know, who you know, who you can influence, and how to overcome these sort of inconveniences in terms of ticking a box and moving on and getting your promotion and whatever it is that you. So that's founded on this seeking recognition issue, which is very psychoanalytical, which again is linked to the psyops involved in the what's going on around us at the moment. Everybody seeks some kind of recognition, you know, not necessarily financial, but some kind of value that they add to somebody else's life. You know, you need to feel needed. And that is definitely, I think, an important part of New Zealand culture. Is the professional identity isn't as pronounced as it is in many other cultures. I'll give you a practical example of that. I was absolutely taken aback when I first went to one of the universities and saw that the lecturers were walking around openly in term time in shorts and jandals. And I would drive past a school, and at 3:15, you know, kicking out time for the students, the teachers would leave at the same time. You know, that those are the kinds of things that would never happen in many other cultures, where a professional identity as an educationalist is committed in more ways than just on the face of it. You know, this is my job, and then I go home, you know. And so that seeking recognition issue, I think, really links up with the meaning of our lives. That factor, how does he put it? Lives are pointless and meaningless. You know, they're all full of bullshit jobs. Well, actually, we haven't only got those bullshit jobs, which are what I'd refer to as gravy trainers, you know, maybe public services, who are very, very top heavy in this country. There's something like, I did the stats once a few years ago, and there's something like 10 times as many public servants in New Zealand as there are in some other developed countries. You know, it's just pointless paper shuffling. But on top of that, you've also got this element of the bullshit jobs that aren't, or they're not supposed to be bullshit jobs, are also bullshit jobs, you know, because there's no recognition of the professional identity, the expertise, the qualifications, this tall poppy syndrome that seems to be ubiquitous in this country. You know, the more qualifications you have, the more of a threat you become to those people in those bullshit jobs at the top of senior management public sectors. So I'll probably stop there. What do you think of my rant so far, Barbara?
I love it. I love any good rant. It's never a rant. It's just, I'm just always so happy when information exchange can actually happen. As you will have seen, our last video was on censorship, and I think that's probably the last 2 years was one of my biggest hurts, actually, to see so many voices silenced, because I never grew up like that. Our family, not that it was always pleasant, but we exchanged information in a lot of ways, in a lot of, not always all that pleasant, but information was exchanged and necessary. My favorite thing to do as a child was sitting with my dad on Sunday morning. There was a program where, I can't remember who it was, a guy invited journalists from all walks of life, and they sat around this oval thing, bar or desk or whatever, with the cameras, and then they had a discussion about everything, any topic. And you know, little me, I thought, oh, wow, that's an opinion, and yeah, I totally agree with that. And then somebody else came from a complete different aspect and went, whoa, yes, that's a point as well. So it was just probably training my mind. Anyway, it was my biggest hurt here, one of my biggest hurts here the last 2 years, that voices were suppressed. It is interesting that when you said, you know, you saw these professors walking in their jandals, hey ho, at least jandals, not barefoot, could be worse. That it almost, to my thinking, almost gives me hope, because I very much I very much like the integral perspective on things. Walking through the lens of a Ken Wilber and the Aquil map and spiral dynamics, and Frédéric Laloux with a new way of reinventing organizations, where I think actually we have to come to work the way we are, with not the way we are. If we're neglected at home, don't pretend that you're only walking around in suits and makeup at work. Be the way on the inside as we are on the outside. I think we're far away from that, but it is. This kind of thinking very much has a place, and with that we can move into self-organized structures, and self-organized structures are, I think, very adaptable. Nature is like that, and possibly very much faster in reacting, in responding to crisis situations. I mean, you mentioned the large numbers of what you call them in English, civil employees, gravy train.
Civil service, important word.
Yes, gravy train riders, and that by itself is just calls for long, tedious processes and meetings and minutes and yes, it's just sticky. And I think it's seen its time. It was good while we needed to replicate systems, to predict them even better, and create budgets and EBITs and all these figures. And I wonder whether we're away. We was getting closer to nature, ecocentric, cosmocentric, and then moving on from there. So the professor in jandals and shorts, that's okay for me. If I would have to have a conversation with them and see where they're at intellectually to gain my respect.
I think it's important to just clarify that I didn't necessarily mean to criticize literally how they look, because obviously that's inappropriate. But for me, outsider, it's almost like symbolic of actually what they're about. And actually about when you talk about coming to work as your authentic self, what I witnessed in a lot of, and what we've witnessed now in the last 2 years, it's actually, it's been more explicit, is actually the authentic self that is in a lot of those academics is not very ethical, has not got the students' best interests at heart, and has real recognition of what I call professional identity. So the formativity of being an academic, being a lecturer, being a professor isn't the same. It doesn't hold the same meaning as what I have come to expect over my 50 years of life, and their lack of respect for my perception of professional identity is portrayed in their lack of attire.
yes, I understand.
Yeah. I see. I get what your meaning is, and like I said, I think we're far away from that one step that you're talking about and that I'm talking about, and actually the future. When you talk about professionalism and so far behind, I can't remember the year, but something like a checklist was not introduced to New Zealand till I think the late 90s or 80s. Like in surgeries, in hospital surgeries, and checklists in general. It's such an important thing, right?
Yeah.
But yes,
remember, we have the "she'll be right, mate," you know, make it work with number 8 wire as our traditional motto. But I can definitely see what you're saying, Ursula, and we have seen this ourselves while we wait for professionals to actually call out miscarriages of justice, while they remain silent for fear of their professional career, and in doing so completely lose, you know, any ethical moral compass that they have because of the fear of their position. Right. You know, and so that's the side of professional ethics, you know, that you're talking about, is that owning that and coming with that authenticity and that ethics of guarding your profession against, you know, such, you know, against unworkable systems, whatever it is. And I think as well, we're such a bloated bureaucracy here. And that it's a monster that feeds itself and churns people out, moves people around. It you know, and it really is, I think, it's control. You know, in New Zealand, we've always actually had these many layers of control, maybe perhaps without realizing it being quite so much. And it really does, once it grabs a hold and wants more regulations to be put in place, then they need more bureaucrats to fulfill that, you know, and it is a self-fulfilling prophecy of like this bloated monster that keeps getting bigger and bigger and taxing people more and more, you know, to pay for itself.
Absolutely. And I think that really links very closely, Asha, it's a really good point, to Mattias's factor about the high levels of free-floating anxiety, because New Zealand has got one of the highest levels of personal debt in the developed world, and also the highest levels of suicide in the OECD. So there's no doubt that people are heavily in debt. The salaries are low. The jobs are relatively unstable, depending on who you know and where you are. And so that adds to this sense of free-floating anxiety that pressures people to do whatever they're required to do. And if that is unethical, then they just go, well, she'll be all right, and hope that it will go away.
Yes, I think yes, absolutely, Ursula. And I think the number 2 point about the experiencing of the lack of meaning, if you're operating within this kind of bureaucratic system, you know, I think the three of us and probably most people expect things to get better and to improve, no matter what your job is. But if you're working within a system that, you know, if it's the health system or the education system, you're working to improve. And when you see successively, you know, decade after decade of trying to improve things, you just get so worn down and it becomes a meaningless exercise. You're just there to be there, to make money, to survive. You're not there to actually uplift things and really improve things. And I think we've seen this in so many different sectors of our New Zealand, you know, society and government departments. You know what they end up doing is they end up just rebranding themselves with a new name and some new marketing, and it's just the same shit rebranded as something else, and it doesn't solve any problems. And I also, you know, I think we've touched on it before, Barbara, about, and I think I spoke to you about this recently too, Ursula, about the fact that the government allows things to get so bad that they then come in and do the rescue. And that, you know, and that fits so much into what's happening here, is that things are allowed to fester and get so bad. And then they go, see, look, this is failing because they didn't do their job in the first place. And then they come in with some other Three Waters or some other big grandiose plan and try to sell that to people based on their own failures. And I think that's a pattern that we've seen in this country a lot.
You mentioned an important element in psychology, the victim triangle, and there's this. I don't know what a fundamental difference it is. I've never. in my whole life, I have never relied on anybody else fixing my problems. Don't say never. I think there were phases in my life where, yes, I too did that. But if there is if anything, when it comes to health, well-being, repairing my kids' toys, my kids used to bring toys back from kindergarten and from their friends and give it to me, my mom will try and fix it. And I think that's a fundamental difference also in thinking. Yes, a government and I grew up in Germany with a very well functioning social system back then, and when I was young, and that is 10 years more than you, Ursula. But that changed, and then I lived in Asia for 17 years, where people are naturally self-reliant. There is not a social system to fall back onto or work towards your pension, or yes, there's such a thing as private health insurance, and a big difference between poor and rich, and but naturally, there was interesting research done in the 2000 or after the 2004 tsunami in Southeast Asia, where trauma workers, and I consider myself a trauma worker, they came in waves into Sri Lanka and Thailand, and you know, saving the world, because now people must be traumatized, and they were dumbfounded because people just, for some reason, they just had a way of bouncing back, natural resilience. So in those countries, I would think that this mass formation would not happen as successfully, where there is just a natural, don't know where it's beeping. There's a natural, natural way to bounce back. What I'm finding here, what you said before, Asha, this, you know, predicting and this, for me, that is a developmental stage, and every person goes through developmental stages, and every society in humanity and countries go through developmental stages. And New Zealand is in this, what Ken Wilber would call achievement orange state, with a tinge of green. And it is just the way it is, and until a next stage through crisis quite often actually begins to arise, and that is maybe, hopefully, for some of us that has happened, and maybe for the powers that be, or whoever is out there making our laws and rules. Maybe in some countries, people were far too advanced, far too independent, far too self-reliant, and far too self-organized, which is, once people are self-organized, you can't oppress them. There is no, you can kiss your totalitarian ideas goodbye, you know?
Mm. Yeah.
So Mattias Desmet talks about mass formation being a kind of hypnosis. And I think that, you know, we've seen the waves of propaganda on, you know, all the media. So there were, you know, it's on the TV. Was the daily, you know, the daily sermon that Jacinda Ardern gave, you know, on the radio, in the newspapers. They are plastering up posters around the towns. I mean, even here in Kerikeri, appearing on the footpath where we walk daily is, you know, is a permanent kind of sticker there reminding you. And then in every shop front, you know, so this is waves of fixing your attention. And Mattias says this, focusing the attention on one story, on one aspect of it, where people can direct their anxiety. And so this whole COVID narrative became that moment. And he says it becomes impossible then to even rationalize or reason with people when they become so fanatical within their belief in what they, of the story that they're holding on to or that they're being told. And so I mean, that's why we found we couldn't talk with friends and family members, because there becomes this cognitive dissonance of not being able to hold multiple storylines, within your psyche. And so I found that really fascinating, and it reminded me in some ways, because he says that, it's when the mass forms like that, and you've got a majority of people that are fully sucked into and fanatical about a particular narrative, that is at the point that they begin to do very cruel actions against anybody who dissents from what that story is.
Yeah.
And I think of the Chinese Cultural Revolution and things like this, where you have whole cultures that got swept up in such fanaticism that they went to such extents that they tried to entirely destroy their history, their temples, their culture. They actually tried to devour their own culture. And the same with, I remember he mentions, Cambodia as well as another one. When the mass starts to turn on people who are not fitting into the narrative, they start to go after certain classes of people. And then when that's done, they pick another group and another group that's, perhaps outside of this mainstream way of thinking. And that keeps the cycle going.
Yeah.
The focal point needs to constantly be you need to attract the focal point, and then it constantly needs to be repeated in a hypnosis. Before the hypnosis, it can break a little bit, but not totally. And that's in all these totalitarian systems that you just mentioned and beyond. It's always been like that. What the main thing is that people with all their four elements that were present before the formation of this mass, they are now connected. They found their tribe. They are now belonging to someone, and they have a common goal. They have a common, and nothing else matters. Everything else is side is not important. And Mattias mentions this Iranian mother who told on her son for being a politically different thinking, or I can't remember what happened. And she proudly put the cord when he was going to be executed. She proudly put the cord round his neck, the rope round his neck, and celebrated herself as a hero, a heroine. And that's how far this can go. That's how crazy this can get.
Yes. Do you know this document, Barbara?
Yes, I've seen that. Yeah.
Okay. So these are the strategies, basically, that the government, this was published 10 years ago. So the UK government had all of the tools that it needed from the behavioural science research in order to basically exploit what you were describing, Barbara, that free floating anxiety and that isolation for this common good, the role that the solution that they wanted to perform.
Yeah.
And certainly, I mean, a lot of the reading I've been doing over the last 2 years has been biographies of the Nazi German, the concentration camp survivors and other, similar historical records. And there's so many stories of people being in the streets, being singled out and beaten up for being part of the other, the out group, and people just watching, not doing anything, and at that point, that the violence and the psychosis, the hypnosis, the mass formation has just gone over the edge to that point where it's humanity has become something pretty monstrous.
That's and that is let's say a recent. Mattias also mentions the increase over the last 200 years, the increase of totalitarian states, right? And goes back to fascinating examples, like the compulsive dancing epidemics in Strasbourg in France, where somebody started to dance, just couldn't stop moving, and everyone joined in, and people actually even died with that. But what I mean, you know, go back a little bit further, the Crusades or the people were burning each other at stake, and drowning women because they were witches, and that's all not so long ago. I mean, there are whole villages in Switzerland where no woman was left, just because people believed that they needed to do that. And
they burnt men as well when they ran out of women. There was when they ran out of women, they singled out men that they thought were witches in disguise and burnt them as well. You know, so it is, like he says, you know, it is self-destructive. At the end, it will collapse itself. And I suppose the issue for us in little old New Zealand, isolated from the rest of the world, is at what point will we reach that? How bad will it get before it is, you know, it collapses in on itself? We've already seen some pretty horrific, you know, treatment of the nurses, for instance. You know, one of the projects I'm involved with is helping the nurses that have been still excluded from the job that they love. Their professional identity has been stripped from them, and they know that there are patients out there who they are keen to help, and they're literally not allowed to help them, which in itself is a torture, let alone, you know, torturing people with an injection. So that, you know, that exclusion, that you know, that it's some horrible things have been done and said, and people are suffering as a result of those actions. Whether they're physical violence or not is kind of, you know, it's a secondary thing. It's the psychological trauma that so many people are suffering. So who knows what the next stage of that is for us.
So in history, I'm just trying to think of, you know, how systems like this always collapse. They self-destruct, and that will happen here as well. I think in a recent interview, Mattias was saying about, you know, it will probably go on for another 5 years until it. I know my inside was screaming as well. Yeah. And but it is very well possible, mainly because people have tools like the Mindspace document that you saw, and you know, all this modeling that they were able to do, the propaganda since Edward Bernay's expertise came in the 30s, and so we've become better and better. I would love to hope that this is it. This is it. We the more people we wake, and what I think what we're doing here is part of it. The more people we present with another way of thinking, and we invite them into this social space that we're creating, there is a chance that people go, oh, hold on a minute, maybe I'll go and check out that old history book and see if it's correct or not. And maybe we have to bring in some other part of history that were never taught at school. So what he says, and that is, I think that's so, for me, stands out so much. We have to continue to speak out, and we have to do that from a very frank and honest and truthful space, without an intentionality, without manipulation, without any rhetoric, or whatever. Just speak out like a 5-year-old would speak out. You know, the emperor has no clothes. Does anybody else bloody see it?
Yeah.
And that is what needs to carry on, and we have to just invite for people to keep doing that in a polite way with all the linguistic abilities they have.
Yeah. On that note, I'd just like to put a plug in for another project which is UK based but internationally relevant. And the details are on reachingpeople.net. Reachingpeople.net. And that's a team of qualified psychologists and sociologists and educationalists, etc., who have put together some actual practical strategies on the speaking out that you're talking about, Barbara, of what kind of thing, literally scripted, you know, what can we do? What can we actually say that will reach people? And there are very particular behavioral science techniques that can be good, could be really useful, can be put to good use in just asking people to step away from it, think about it. And it takes time, you know, they have to go away. Their curiosity is the only thing that breaks the spell. We cannot break it, you know. That's the only thing that will happen, is people will go away. Doesn't take long, you know. People have said to me in the past, when they took you know, the aerial poisoning strategy, for instance, at face value for all those years, when they started to question it, they went away. It only took them an hour, maybe two, of research before they realized that they had been conned. And it will be the same for this, that the information is so prolific now. There's so many expert voices out there that are on platforms that are easily accessible, on Spotify, for instance, and even YouTube, and on various websites. Yeah, it is really important, as you say, not to get violent or hurtful or abusive. It is tempting because we are angry. But just, you know, that reachingpeople.net website is a really useful resource. And I'm sure there's others as well that maybe, you know, Asha, we could maybe put together the comments conversation at some point.
Yeah, we'll link that definitely.
Yeah, he mentions in chapter 3, and it comes up again in chapter 5, that I'm currently reading or listening to. He calls it linguistic uncertainty, as opposed to animals. Humans have a linguistic uncertainty, and that pretty much depends on languages, I would think.
Yeah.
And I do speak quite a number of languages, and I know that every language is different. Germany being one of the biggest uncertain language, because we have anything important, like a conjugated verb, right at the very end of the sentence. You fall asleep before you listen to it all, you know. So there is this. So what's coming next? But how does it end? Oh, this is what you wanted to do. So I think that's an interesting phenomenon. And also, what I would like to invite people who are listening to this talk or viewing this video to speak out in person. He talks about the difference between a digital voice to the human psyche, and he actually directly relates it to depression when people are not, or babies are not brought up with mothers' voices. I think he actually says specifically, he says mothers' voices. And instead there is, you know, more digital contact, more, even if it's music playing, not in real, but actually through the radio or computer nowadays. So that I need to revisit that and go a bit more into depth about that. But the direct connection he makes to depression from rain, you know, as a result from this deprivation of real voices is important. So, and that was, of course, in Mindspace. You see that the whole point was actually to isolate people so they cannot touch and they cannot be in contact and they cannot apply direct human word and language, which was part of the nearly successful plan that they put in place.
That's right. Yeah, he does talk, and I've got the page open. He does talk about, there's a picture of a lamb which is being supposedly grown in a synthetic womb. So yeah, he talks about the importance of the mother's voice to the child even before it's born, you know, and how when it's born, then at that point it already recognizes the tone and inflection, the feelings that are, you know, not necessarily said openly but felt, how important that is. And so contrasting that to the surveillance we were talking about earlier, the monitoring, which is all part of transhumanism, that, you know, that is on the agenda for us, whether or not in the future. I'll just read something that he says at the top of that page, which I love, a quote that he says, science adapts its theory to reality, whereas ideology adapts reality to theory. I thought that's quite profound, because we are living with these ideologies all around us, and our reality is, you know, what we all love, you know, what we know, what we love, getting out into our gardens, talking to each other, hopefully face to face at some point. You know, that's what makes life worth living. And picking up on your point about language, Barbara, I know we need to finish in a moment, don't we, Asha? But this is another quote that I love. Life itself can be defended only in terms of metaphor and poetry. Yet these usually sound less loud than the monotonous droning of mechanistic arguments.
Yes.
A mechanistic argument that was on the podium of truth that we heard every day during lockdown from wonderful Jacinda. You know, that's the opposite, the absolute antithesis of what we love about language, that the ambiguity of language, spoken and you know, unspoken. That is what humanity is for us.
Absolutely. And that also in our what he points out, that we, of course, with the words that we're using and the way that the word, and he mentions the example of sun and then sunshine and another version of sun he mentioned. Anyway, how we can never really know what we mean, never mind what the other person means, and which is part of what makes this all really, really important and interesting. And I just love this whole linguistic uncertainty, and we have to feel at home with that. There is a sleep strategy that with my work at a health store, we see a lot of sleep issues, anxiety issues, depression, and gut related issues, of course, now the last 2 years. And for people to actually fall asleep, they need to be fine with uncertainty, and they need to fall back into trust that the world around them is safe. Otherwise, there's this high alert, which keeps them from sleeping, you know, and yeah, so that will be our work as well, to give people strategies how to fall asleep, how to repair their mental and physical health. But yes,
isn't it horrific to think that our government has inflicted such a personal trauma to us that we can't even sleep safely in our own homes at night for fear of what might be announced, you know, next. It's like a trauma nobody's really experienced before. It's not, you know, it's no, you know, when you think about in London, when there was people in the underground, you know, sheltering from bombs and etc. You know, there was the physical sense of that bomb. You know, the bombs were coming, and you'd hear the sound, you know, of the whistle or whatever, and the siren going off to warn people to seek safety. But they still had people around them who were feeling the same fear, and they had, even if it wasn't necessarily 100% safe, they still had those bunkers where they had an element of safety. And if we are in our own beds at home at night and we can't even sleep for fear of what our governments might do to us, that is very troubling, isn't it?
Absolutely, and the technology, you know, the link to the technology of having our smartphones equipped in a way that they can send the civil defense emergency warning thing, and it shook me to the core, really. That
and that's designed to do, you know, that alarm system we're talking about, the beeping to warn us that we're going from a level further down in our lockdown or whatever, you know, that was neuro-linguistic programming on a level never experienced before, and it, you know, that normally it's the hypnotist, as Mattias says, that snaps his fingers and takes us out of this mass formation. But of course, there is never going to be that beeping sound from our phones to tell us that it's all over now, and it was all a lie and a pretense. That's never going to happen.
That's a good idea. That's a good idea. We can talk to some software developers to develop that sound for our phones.
Yeah.
All right, ladies, let's wrap up. But I think we've just touched on so many different interesting aspects to this. I just wanted to
take one.
What's that?
Today. That was take one today.
Yeah, take one. So the conditions that create this mass formation, and which in itself becomes the vehicle for these cruel, unfathomable, you know, perpetrations against other people, you know, against our children, like the Iranian woman who put the noose around her own son's neck, like the people in Germany perhaps who dogged on their neighbors, you know, that they were Jewish. These acts, these grievous acts against each other. So the conditions that bring this mass formation together are the isolation, the loneliness, the lack of social bond, you know, and that was exacerbated by the fact that we were all locked down and weren't able to connect with our families, with our friends. And so that caused a lot of anxiety. I think the whole pandemic itself and the concept of a virus coming to wipe out people in our community and people in our country really prompts the question of what is the meaning? There was no meaning given behind it. You know, we can't make any sense of it, you know, and that anxiety. And so when the instructions, you know, come along on how we're going to handle this, there's this loyalty, you know, that you feel to that cause because you feel like you can do something. You feel like you can be part of the solution. And that gives it meaning in some way. You know, so many people I'm wearing a mask for my elderly parents, or I'm not going to go visit my, you know, my friend in the nursing home for their safety. I'm going to keep away. And so it was this virtuous kind of like doing these acts because you think you're helping, but then the flip side of that is the negativity that's directed towards the people that aren't doing it, that, you know, and that became quite a lot of vitriol against, you know, oh, you don't care about the elderly, you know, this whole psychological thing of you're not, you know, you're not one of the team of 5 million, you're not trying to save us all from COVID. And so I feel, you know, that, and I've listened to Mattias a little bit about these little jewels that we can put out, the little flickers of humanity, you know, the little gestures that we can do. You know, if it's isolation and lack of social bond that we're dealing with, then we need to be loving each other more. You know, we need to be reaching out to each other more and showing our humanness more than ever, because that's what will resonate with people, you know, because you can't be so cruel in the face of such humanity. I don't believe you can anyway. I'd like to think, you know, that becomes the trigger for people to really, you know, do I want to do this act against my own countrymen? Do I want to commit this act against my own family? And re-strengthen those actual bonds that we have between each other, rather than between our isolated selves and this narrative of salvation, you know, that's coming at us. So humanity, I think, was the key word that you said before, Ursula, you know, is bringing the humanity back into everything that we do.
Yeah. Writing letters, you know, printing out photographs, you know, just giving each other a hug and playing some music together. You know, that's what life is about. So
that's right. Yeah, definitely.
You mentioned something really important, Ursula. To not finalize it, to not correct it, to not have that signal at midnight saying, yep, it's all over. And I mean, starting with, I can't remember what our modeler here is in the guy who's always predicting how many million people will fall over dead tomorrow. But the guy I remember from England was at the London School of Neil Ferguson.
Yeah.
And I mean, nobody, at least I haven't heard, nobody in the mainstream media says that prediction of 40 million deaths within very short time was not true. We do apologize and we're deeply sorry.
Yeah,
I think people should say that. Somebody should actually, maybe not he himself, but somebody with authenticity and with integrity should say that.
Yeah.
And maybe, you know, maybe now it's been said. You're saying it.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, well, we should leave it there, ladies. But Ursula, do you have another quote that you might like to share before we?
Yes, please. I was thinking that.
Might be good to finish with a quote and pick up on some of these topics again soon.
So what about the fact that man and nature form a mystical unity and can exist in harmony is considered to be romantic and unrealistic idea, even downright dangerous, considering the pressing issue of climate change.
Yes. And that will lead us to our discussion on transhumanism. Yes, yeah. It all comes back to nature, and that humanity is our nature. And everything that we're connected with here, biological life, it's something that we're going to have another really interesting discussion about. Yeah.
The cunning plan, you can't just, I mean, sometimes I just go, that hell, you know, if you want to come up with a marketing strategy for a product, this has probably been one of the best. But, and the human spirit, you just cannot stop the human spirit. You know, if you think of, I think everyone, even I mean, maybe some weird thinkers would look back in disgust and dismay onto the Third Reich and Hitler and Nazi time. But what people love to remember are people like Schindler and the Anne Frank and those people who, and that's the same here in every crisis. Those and that is a spirit that you can't destroy. You can never.
That's right.
You know.
My grandfather was a conscientious objector, Barbara.
Yeah, I think my parents were, certainly my dad was in a very firm position as well. I've got to maybe send that to you one day, Asha, the translation of his letter about the war, which he wrote in the last year before he died.
Yeah, that would be brilliant.
Yeah.
Let's leave it there, Ursula, Barbara, and please send through any links that you want to pop in the description, and I'll get this video up as soon as I can. Yeah, but I look forward to our next discussion because it's just such a massive topic and it branches off in so many interesting areas.
Definitely. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much,
time.
Ursula. Thanks. Enjoyed that. Thank you so much, Asha, as usual. And see you soon.
Yeah.
Thank you both.